The iron was still hot when Lady Constance pressed Margot's hands against it. Not in rage, in calculation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of the fire in the grate and the particular sound that follows when skin meets heat. Brief, irreversible, and quiet in the way that only the worst things are quiet. The kitchen maid turned toward the window. The cook disappeared into the pantry. This was not because they did not care. This was because they had learned, in the 3 years since Lady Constance had occupied Fielding Manor, that caring visibly was expensive in ways they could not afford. Margot did not scream. She had made that decision somewhere between the moment Lady Constance's hand closed around her wrist and the moment the iron made contact. That screaming would give Lady Constance something she wanted. Proof that this had worked. Proof that the thing she had reached for had been found and destroyed. Margot would not give her that. So she pressed her lips together and looked at the far wall and breathed steadily, the way she breathed through the difficult passages in her compositions, the ones that required both hands to do something different simultaneously and the mind to hold the whole piece together while they did it. Lady Constance released her wrists and stepped back. She smoothed her skirts. She looked at Margot's hands with the expression of a woman surveying completed work. "A pianist with ruined hands," she said quietly, "is no pianist at all." Then she walked out of the kitchen and the door closed behind her. And Margot stood alone at the stove with her palms pressed flat against her own dress because the cold fabric was the only thing available and the pain was looking for somewhere to go. Outside, at the end of the Fielding Manor Drive, a sealed letter sat in the postbag that had arrived that morning. It was addressed to Miss Margot Fielding in a handwriting that was precise and unhurried. It bore the Whitmore crest. Lady Constance had seen it first. It was now in the drawer of her writing desk, and it would remain there. Before we go any further, I have to stop and ask you something. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story already has your chest tight and your hands curled in your lap, then you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. But please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single one of those actions reaches back to us in ways you cannot imagine. All right. Now let us go back to Margot, because this story is only just beginning. Margot Fielding was 22 years old in the winter of 1881, and she had been invisible in her own home for 3 of those years. Her father, Thomas Fielding, had been a solicitor of quiet reputation and considerable warmth. He had the particular quality of goodness that does not announce itself, the kind that shows up in small and consistent ways, in the extra chair pulled to the fire on cold evenings, in the way he remembered the name of every person he had ever done business with and asked after their families by name. He had loved Margot's mother with the steady and unglamorous devotion of a man who understood that love was not a feeling, but a practice. When her mother died, the house did not simply lose a person. It lost its organizing principle. The warmth remained in the furniture, in the curtains her mother had chosen, in the piano that sat in the east-facing parlor and caught the morning light in a way that had always seemed to Margot like something deliberate. But the warmth was quiet now, residual. Thomas Fielding grieved for 2 years. Then, in the way that good-natured men sometimes do when grief has made them lonely enough, he made a decision that felt like relief and was not. Lady Constance arrived 6 months after the wedding with 1 daughter, Sylvia, 2 trunks of expensive clothing, and the particular kind of authority that fills a vacuum left by loss. She was not cruel in those early months. She was simply efficient in the way she redistributed the household's attention. The better rooms went to Sylvia, the better tutors, the invitations to the county gatherings where eligible men of standing appeared. Margot received what remained, which was the household accounts, the mending schedules, and the piano. The piano Lady Constance could not take. The county already knew about Margot's playing. Thomas Fielding had spoken of it with the particular pride of a man who understands he has witnessed something genuine. Removing the piano or forbidding its use would have drawn the kind of attention Lady Constance could not afford. So she left it. And Margot, who had been composing her own music since she was 14, now retreated into it the way a person retreats into the one room in a house that still belongs to them. She composed in the early mornings before the household woke. She worked on manuscript paper at the small writing desk in her room, scratching notation in the dim light, hearing the music in her mind before her hands could play it, then sitting at the piano in the east parlor and discovering what the piece actually was beneath what she had imagined it to be. She had filled 4 manuscript books by the time she was 20. By 22, she had filled 7. Thomas Fielding died in the autumn of 1878, a fever that arrived quickly and left nothing behind. He had been gone 3 years by the Tuesday morning of the kitchen, and in those 3 years, Lady Constance had grown considerably less careful about what she did and considerably more certain that no one was watching closely enough to matter. She had been wrong about the last part for precisely 6 weeks. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Whitmore, was 34 years old and was not a man who attended private recitals as a matter of habit. He attended this one because his aunt had organized it and because declining would have required an explanation he did not wish to give. He sat in the 3rd row with his hands resting on his knees and his watchful gray eyes fixed on the program with the expression of a man prepared to endure 2 hours of competent but unremarkable music and then go home. Margot Fielding was the 4th performer of the evening. She sat down at the piano without adjusting the bench, without arranging her skirts with any particular care, without looking at the audience to gauge its mood. She simply sat, placed her hands on the keys, and began. What she played was not on the program. It was her own composition, a piece she had written across 3 consecutive winter mornings, a piece that began quietly, almost tentatively, and then opened into something that was neither simple nor complicated but was instead the rarer thing, which is true. It was music that sounded like it had been written by someone who understood loss, not as an event, but as a permanent alteration of the landscape, something you did not recover from but learned to navigate differently. The Duke did not move for the duration of the piece. When she finished, the room gathered itself and applauded with the warm appreciation of people who have just received more than they came expecting. The Duke was the last person in the room to bring his hands together, not because he was slow, because he was still listening to something that had already ended. Lady Constance, standing at the back of the room with a glass she had not touched, watched the Duke's expression for 4 seconds. Then she looked at Margot, sitting at the piano with her hands still resting on the keys, and then back at the Duke. The calculation that crossed her face in that moment was swift and total and invisible to everyone in the room, except possibly Sylvia, who had learned over many years to read her mother's face the way sailors read weather. That was the night Lady Constance began to plan the Tuesday morning. And the Duke sent his first letter the morning after the recital. It was not a long letter. Edmund Ashford was not a man who used more words than a situation required. It said that he had been moved by what he heard. It said that he would consider it a privilege to hear Miss Fielding play again, at her convenience, and under whatever arrangement suited her. It said, in the final line, written in the direct and unhurried hand of a man who had decided that clarity was a form of respect, that he hoped she would not consider the enquiry presumptuous. Lady Constance intercepted it at the door. She read it twice. She placed it in the drawer of her writing desk and said nothing to Margot and nothing to anyone else. 3 days later, a second letter arrived. This one she did not read. She placed it directly in the drawer beneath the first. The Duke, receiving no reply, did not assume indifference. He was not a man who assumed. He observed. He noted. He considered the possibilities available and eliminated the ones that did not hold up under examination. He sent his steward, a composed and meticulous man named Graves, to make quiet inquiries in the village. Not about Margot specifically, about the Fielding household, about Lady Constance, about the 3 years since Thomas Fielding's death, and what the village understood about the management of the estate and the people living in it. Graves returned 4 days later with information that caused the Duke to sit very still at his desk for a long time. He did not act immediately. He was not a man who acted on partial information, but he continued to watch and to gather and to build his understanding of the situation with the patience of someone who knows that the right action at the right moment is worth considerably more than a dozen hasty ones. But something had settled in him that evening that had not been there before the recital, something that had no precise name, but that functioned like a compass, orienting everything quietly toward a fixed point. If you have ever watched something you built with your whole soul be taken from you, stay exactly where you are. This story was written for you. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this is your moment. Hit that button now. We will be here when you come back. Lady Constance's campaign had its own architecture, and she built it with the same precision she brought to everything. That Margot's burned hands were explained as a kitchen accident. She had been careless with the stove grate, Lady Constance said with a sigh that contained exactly the right measure of maternal exhaustion. It was the kind of explanation that could not be challenged without evidence and that most people accepted because the alternative required them to believe something they found uncomfortable to believe about a woman who presented so well in public. The bandages were visible at the county gathering 2 weeks later, where Sylvia was presented to the Duke with the full deployment of Lady Constance's social machinery. The correct gown, the rehearsed topics of conversation, the careful positioning near the Duke's line of sight that Lady Constance had been refining for months. Margot had been told the gathering was cancelled. Now she discovered it was not from Agnes, the housemaid, who let it slip in the corridor and then went pale with the particular fear of someone who has said something that cannot be unsaid. Margot asked Agnes one question, whether any letters had arrived for her in the preceding weeks. Agnes looked at the floor for a long moment. Then she said she was not certain. Then she looked at the floor again. That was answer enough. Lady Constance found out that Margot had asked. She found out the same evening through a channel Margot had not anticipated and could not have identified. The response was not physical. It was quieter than physical and in certain ways more complete. The following morning, Margot's manuscript books were gone from her writing desk. All 7 of them. 3 years of composition, 400 pages of notation, and every piece she had written since her mother died, gone without explanation, without acknowledgement, without a single word from Lady Constance that indicated anything had occurred at all. Margot went to the east parlor that evening. She sat at the piano. She placed her bandaged hands on the keys and held them there, and did not play because she could not yet, the palms still too tender for pressure. She sat in the silence that a piano makes when it is present but not sounding, which is a particular kind of silence. And she looked at the keys, and she made herself a promise in the cold of that room that she intended to keep. She was not finished. She did not know how to make that true yet. But she knew it was true, and knowing it, in that moment, in that room, was sufficient. The Duke stopped attending social gatherings in February, but he was seen in the village instead. He visited St. Clement's Church on a Tuesday morning and spoke at length with Reverend Hale, who had known Thomas Fielding for 20 years and who had been carrying a quiet and specific discomfort about the Fielding household since the first winter of Lady Constance's occupancy. Reverend Hale was not a man who spoke ill of his parishioners without cause. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning the difference between the cause that existed and the cause that could be named, and he had been waiting for someone with enough standing to make naming it worth the risk. He told the Duke what he knew. The Duke listened to all of it with a still face and a very alert mind. He asked 3 questions, each shorter than the answer it produced. When Reverend Hale finished, the Duke thanked him with the brevity of a man who is holding more than he intends to show and who will process it privately. Then he walked to Agnes's family cottage at the edge of the village, because Graves had identified Agnes as someone worth speaking to, and the Duke had learned to trust Graves's assessments entirely. Agnes came to the door with flour on her apron and the expression of someone who had been half expecting this visit for weeks and was relieved and terrified in equal measure that it had finally arrived. She invited him in. She made tea she did not drink. She told him everything. The letters, the manuscript books, the Tuesday morning, the gathering Margot had not been permitted to attend. She told it in the plain, a sequential way of someone who has been rehearsing the account in her own mind for months and is grateful to finally deliver it to someone who can do something with it. The Duke did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he sat for a moment in Agnes's small kitchen with the tea cooling in front of him. Then he said, "You have done the right thing." He said it the way he said most things, without performance and without excess. Agnes pressed her hands together in her lap and nodded and did not trust herself to speak. That evening, the Duke sat with his solicitor for 2 hours. The following morning, he wrote an invitation to a formal dinner at Whitmore Hall, addressed to the Fielding household by name, listing every member including Miss Margot Fielding. And he gave it to his footman with specific instructions about delivery and about what was to be reported back to him regarding the household's response. The footman returned the following afternoon. Miss Margot Fielding was unwell, the footman said. Lady Constance had communicated this at the door with the smooth and practiced regret of a woman who had delivered this particular message before. Miss Sylvia and Lady Constance herself would, of course, be honored to attend. The Duke nodded once. He said nothing. His expression, the footman told the housekeeper later that evening, was the expression of a man who has just received the last piece of information he needed and is deciding what to do with it. The dinner at Whitmore Hall was the finest event the county had seen that season. 14 guests, 6 courses, and the table set with the Whitmore silver that was brought out only for occasions the Duke considered genuinely significant, which the housekeeper noted privately was not something that happened often. The flowers were white, the candles were generous. The conversation, in the early courses, moved through the expected channels with the expected warmth of a gathering that believes itself to be a social occasion. Lady Constance arrived in deep green silk with pearls at her throat, and the bearing of a woman arriving at the conclusion of a campaign. She has won. Sylvia sat beside her in pale rose, her posture impeccable, her smile arranged with the care of someone who has been instructed on what this evening requires of her. They were seated near the Duke. Everything had proceeded exactly as Lady Constance had designed it. And the Duke was a perfect host. He was attentive and courteous and gave nothing away, which Lady Constance read as the behavior of a man who had accepted the situation and was moving forward within it. She lifted her glass during the third course and allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, a breath that was not entirely controlled. She should have known better. Composure in a man like Edmund Ashford was never evidence of acceptance. It was evidence of patience. He rose during the 4th course. He did not call for silence. He did not need to. When the Duke of Whitmore rose at his own table, the room adjusted itself around him without being asked. He said that he had been attempting to correspond with Miss Margot Fielding of Fielding Manor for some weeks. He said the letters had not been delivered, and he said that Miss Margot had not been informed of this evening's invitation, despite being listed explicitly within it. He said that he had spoken with Reverend Hale and with a member of the Fielding household staff and with 2 additional witnesses whose accounts he had referred, as of that morning, to his solicitor and to Magistrate Carlyle, who was seated 3 places to his left and who nodded once in the quiet way of a man confirming a fact already known to him. He did not look at Lady Constance while he said any of it. Every other person at the table looked at nothing else. Lady Constance sat with her spine perfectly straight and her glass still in her hand, and her face composed with the total and practiced control of a woman who has spent 20 years perfecting this particular expression for exactly this kind of emergency. It held for perhaps 5 seconds. Then something happened beneath it, not collapse. She was too disciplined for collapse, but a fracture, the kind that does not show on the surface but that changes the structural integrity of everything above it permanently. Sylvia set down her fork. She did not look at her mother. She looked at the table. And on her face, visible only briefly and only to those watching carefully, was an expression that was not quite relief, but was its necessary predecessor. The carriage arrived at Fielding Manor the following morning at 9:30. Margot was in the east parlor. She was sitting at the piano with her hands resting on the keys, not playing, simply resting, the way she had been doing every morning since the burning, because the contact reminded her that the keys were still there, and so was she. And Agnes appeared in the doorway with a sealed note and the expression of someone delivering something she has been hoping to deliver for a long time. Margot read the note once, then again. The Duke's handwriting was precise and unhurried, consistent with everything she had come to understand about him from one evening in a room full of people who had not quite heard what he heard. The note said that he had learned what had been done. It said that her manuscript books were safe. Agnes had hidden them before Lady Constance could arrange their permanent removal, had wrapped them in oilcloth and placed them beneath the floorboard of the garden shed where she kept her bulbs through winter, and they had been there for 6 weeks waiting. It said that he would consider it a privilege if she would come to Whitmore Hall at her own convenience and under no obligation whatsoever. And at the bottom, in a slightly different hand, as though it had been added after the letter was already finished, and then added anyway because leaving it out would have been a form of dishonesty. "I have not forgotten what I heard you play." Margot read that line 3 times. She thought about the Tuesday morning and the drawer full of unopened letters and the 7 manuscript books hidden under oilcloth in a garden shed. She thought about 3 years of making herself smaller and quieter and more useful and less visible in a house that was technically hers and had never quite felt like it. She thought about the east parlor and the morning light and the particular silence a piano makes when it is present, but not sounding. Then she folded the note, placed it in her dress pocket, and told Agnes to inform the driver she would need 15 minutes. She was not going to rush. She had waited 3 years. She could take 15 minutes to dress properly. She pressed both bandaged palms flat against the keys one final time, not playing, just pressing, just reminding herself. And then she stood and went upstairs. She arrived at Whitmore Hall in the late morning. The Duke met her in the entrance hall, not the formal drawing room. The entrance hall, which was itself a statement, though he would not have described it that way because he was not a man who thought in terms of statements. He simply thought in terms of what was correct. Then he looked at her hands first. Only briefly. The way a person looks at something they were not present to prevent and carry the weight of that absence in their expression for just a moment before returning to the present. Then he looked at her face, and his expression settled into the particular steadiness that she had noticed from across a room 6 weeks ago and had not been able to entirely stop thinking about since. He did not offer pity. He offered a chair, tea, and the direct and unhurried attention of a man who has been trying to have a conversation for 6 weeks and intends to have it properly. They talked for 2 hours. About her father, the kind of man he had been, the specific quality of his goodness that had made his absence such a structural loss, about the compositions, when she had started writing her own music, what the process was, whether she heard the piece whole before she wrote it or whether she discovered it in the writing, about the recital and what she had been thinking in the final movement, which was the question no one had asked her, and that she had consequently been carrying the answer to alone, which was that she had been thinking about her mother and about the particular way grief changes the quality of the light in a room you associated with the person you lost. He listened to all of it without interrupting and without the expression that men sometimes wore when they were enduring a woman's interior life until she ran out of it. He listened the way he did everything, completely, and with the specific attention of someone who considers what they are hearing worth the full use of their faculties. When she asked why he had pursued the matter, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because what I heard you play deserved to exist in the world, and because the person who wrote it deserved better than what was being done to her." She looked at him steadily. He did not look away. He was not performing sincerity. He was simply being accurate, which for Edmund Ashford had always been the same thing. Lady Constance's position in the county did not recover. The magistrate's review of the Fielding estate management, conducted over the following 2 months, found a pattern of financial decisions made in Margot's name without her knowledge or consent. A finding that carried legal consequences. Lady Constance's solicitor spent considerable effort attempting to reduce with partial success. The social consequences required no legal process. And the county reached its own conclusions in the quiet and efficient way of communities that have been watching something wrong and are relieved to have the suspicion confirmed. Invitations thinned. Morning calls were not repeated. The drawing rooms that had previously received Lady Constance with warmth found themselves unavoidably occupied on the mornings she called. Sylvia left for her aunt's house in Bath and wrote Margot a letter that was careful and not quite an apology, but was the most honest thing she had written in years. Margot kept it. She did not reply immediately. She had learned in 3 years of managing an existence inside someone else's design that the decisions made from stillness were the ones worth making. Margot's hands healed through the spring, and the left palm stiffened in cold weather and would probably always carry some evidence of that Tuesday morning. She had made her peace with this. The scar was hers. It was part of the account of what she had survived, and she was not interested in pretending the account was different than it was. By March, she was playing again. Not perfectly, not yet, but playing. She sat at the Whitmore Hall piano on a Thursday afternoon, because the Duke had made clear without ceremony that the instrument was available whenever she wished to use it. And she played the piece she had written the winter before the recital, the piece she had been revising in her head during the 6 weeks her hands were healing because she could not yet play it through and the only available instrument was her own mind. Now she played it all the way through, and then sat with her hands in her lap for a moment in the particular silence that follows a piece that has gone the way it was supposed to go. The Duke appeared in the doorway. He had been in the next room with his estate correspondence, and the door between them had been open, and he had heard every note. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You changed the ending." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It needed to be different than I first wrote it." He considered this. "Better?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something had confirmed what he already believed but wanted to hear confirmed. Then he returned to his correspondence. She returned to the piano. The afternoon continued in that way, quiet, ordinary, and very good. They were married in the autumn. The wedding was not large. It did not need to be. The church was full enough with the people who actually mattered, which is a different and considerably smaller category than the people who are typically invited to a duke's wedding. Agnes sat in the fourth pew in her best dress with her hands folded in her lap and cried through the vows and the reading and most of the recessional and made no attempt whatsoever to pretend otherwise. Reverend Hale spoke the words he had been speaking for 30 years with the particular warmth he reserved for occasions he believed were right. Hungraves stood at the back with his hands behind him and the expression of a man who has witnessed the correct conclusion of a matter he was involved in from the beginning and finds it satisfying in the precise and private way of someone who does not require acknowledgement. Margot's hands were ungloved. She had decided this deliberately and without drama. The scars on her palms were faint now, nearly invisible in most lights. But they were there. And they were hers. And she was not interested in covering what was hers. Edmund held her hands during the vows with the careful and deliberate gentleness of a man who knows their history and has made a private decision about their future. He did not make a performance of the gentleness. He simply held her hands the way he did everything, completely, and with the full weight of his attention, and without any intention of doing otherwise. She became the Duchess of Whitmore on a Saturday in October. On the Sunday morning, she sat at the Whitmore Hall piano as the morning light came through the east-facing windows and played the piece she had written for the recital all the way through. Both hands, the revised ending, without stopping once. Edmund sat in the chair by the window with his morning correspondence untouched in his lap and listened to every note and did not move until the last one had finished and the room had settled back into its ordinary quiet. Then he said, "Play it again." And she did. This is where Margot's story ends, not in the kitchen with the iron, not in the cold parlor with her bandaged hands on silent keys, not in the east wing of a house that had never quite felt like hers. It ends here, out in the morning light, with both hands playing and someone in the room who asked to hear it again. What Lady Constance did on that Tuesday morning was not simply cruel, it was a calculation. The calculation of a woman who had looked at Margot's gift and understood that it was the one thing she possessed that could not be managed or redirected or quietly removed. The piano could not be taken without the county noticing, so she tried to take the hands instead. She failed, not because her plan was imprecise. It was not imprecise. She failed because she made the error that people who operate in the dark always eventually make. She assumed that because no one was watching, no one would ever watch. She had not accounted for a man in the third row of a private recital who was still listening after the music had stopped. There is something worth understanding about Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Whitmore. He did not save Margot. He recognized her. There is a difference worth noting, and the difference is this. Margot had already decided in the cold of the east parlor with her bandaged hands on silent keys that she was not finished. She had already made the promise to herself that she intended to keep. Edmund did not give her that resolve. She arrived with it. What he gave her was a door she had not been permitted to reach, and she walked through it herself. The music she composed in the years that followed was considered by those who heard it to be the finest of her life. She continued writing until she was well into her 60s. 7 manuscript books became 40. The piece she played at the recital, the one Edmund had asked to hear again on the morning after their wedding, was performed at the Whitmore Hall concert in the summer of 1889 by a small ensemble she had arranged herself. And the county that had watched Lady Constance construct her erasure sat in the candlelit hall and listened to what had survived it. Edmund sat in the third row. He did not move for the duration of the piece. When it ended and the room gathered itself into applause, He was the last person to bring his hands together. Not because he was slow, because he was still listening to something that had just finished, the way he had always listened, completely and without reserve, the way he had listened from the very beginning. Some things do not change. The right ones never do. Thank you so much for staying to the very end. And if this story moved something in you, if Margot's hands on those silent keys stayed with you, if Edmund's patience felt like something you needed to see, then please do one thing right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Not a casual forward, a deliberate share with a word that says this one is worth their time, because stories about dignity and endurance only travel as far as the people who carry them. Subscribe if you have not yet. Leave us a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single one of you matters to us. Until next time, keep listening. The right people always hear.